Hello everyone, Horny Alf back for another 40K reaction video. And last week we started the 40K timeline explained by Weshammer. I broke it off halfway, but we ended at the end of the Age of Strife and the uh, appearance of the Emperor on the scene. So we're gonna continue this. But before we do that, I want to thank everyone who's been watching my videos, leaving me comments, giving me suggestions for videos. You guys are awesome. This community has been very supportive of my videos and supportive of teaching me about this awesome franchise IP, whatever you want to call it. I've also been really enjoying the video games Darktide, and I've also been playing Vermintide, but also Space Marine 2. But let's go ahead, without further ado, let's go ahead and get this started.
The Emperor saw this as the moment where he would finally reveal himself, and he would lead the humans of Terra back into the stars, reuniting the entirety of the human race under one banner, under the Imperium of mankind.
And for those who didn't see my last video, if you're just jumping in at this portion, I have seen Bricky's timeline video, 40K timeline video, so I know some of this. However, Weshammer, from what I've seen from the last video I did on his 40K timeline, he goes into a bit more detail. He provides stories that that Bricky did not include. Bricky was more surface level and injected a little more humor. I also got some of the comments on the last video when I asked questions about some of the origins of the Emperor. Some people were saying the stuff that Weshammer said was contested or could also be seen as another origin of many origins potentially, or trying to leave it as still a bit of a mystery. And some people explained it, what Weshammer told me so I could understand it better. That certain stuff like what's her name that was worked with the Emperor to create the Primarchs, that she wasn't literally their mother, but she was one of the scientists that worked on the project, so they kind of considered her a mother of some sort. But all that aside, let's go ahead and continue this.
Now, in order to do this, he would have to reunite Terra first.
At this point in the timeline, the human empire has completely collapsed. All of the planets are cut off from one another, and the universe has become an incredibly terrifying place. Terra itself has become basically a wasteland ruled over by barbarians. But this is the turning point, where the—
Yeah, it's what some other videos I saw. I think it was Bricky's, but he basically Earth evolved into basically like a Mad Max landscape of just death and destruction. And this is what kind of triggered the Emperor to step up, and it was his time to intervene.
The Emperor unites everybody and sets off into the stars to reunite the galaxy. This is the moment where hope gets reintroduced back to the storyline, although admittedly, that's not going to last for very long.
Over the almost 40,000 years that the Emperor had been alive, he had seen a lot of stuff, and had become a master of pretty much every field of study you can think of. And this included the science of gene forging. And through this, the Emperor would create two of his own superhuman factions, the Custodians and the Thunder Warriors. The former being the pinnacle of humanity, the ultimate creation, functionally immortal and the peak of physical and mental perfection. Each was a handcrafted demigod, whereas the Thunder Warriors were genetically enhanced men taken from the various barbarian tribes across Terra. Now, the Custodians on one hand were really difficult to make and required artistic perfection, but the Thunder Warriors on the other hand, the Emperor cut a lot of corners with them. If the Custodians were the peak of perfection and the best that humanity could ever seek to become, the Thunder Warriors on the other hand took all of the worst elements of humanity and cranked them up to 11. They were hyper-aggressive brutes, fixated on nothing but violence. However, since they were cheap to make, the Emperor was able to make a lot more of them than the Custodians.
All right, that's interesting because in Bricky's timeline video, he doesn't explain. The only thing he explained is that the Emperor decided to destroy the Thunder Warriors after retaking Earth. He never explained why, but that actually clarifies that they were a means to an end, and then once he achieved what he needed to, he decided to get rid of them.
Now, one by one, the Emperor and his armies toppled all of the techno-barbarian warlords, and any small nation that had started either bent a knee to him or was destroyed. Now, at one point, he perfected the formula for mass-produced super soldiers and would cease production of the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors at this point were genetically unstable. They were prone to having shortened lifespans, and the longer they were in service, the more their minds would start to degrade. And supposedly many of them were starting to go crazy and were harder and harder to control. The Emperor believed that they had served their purpose, and he would have no need of them going forward, and thus he would order his custodians to wipe them out. He had
Yep, and that's what I heard from Bricky's video, and that's where I believe, what I understand is that if the Emperor wanted to continue his reuniting of humanity after taking Terra, he would need the Custodes, a more level-headed, although some of the stuff I've heard about some of the Space Marine legions, not all of their leaders, Primarchs, were very level-headed, but you know, more level-headed than the previous warriors. So
already begun work on his new super soldiers, the Astartes. He had taken what he had learned from the Thunder
sorry, I was mistaken. I said Custodes. I meant Astartes.
Warriors, but perfected them. Whereas the Thunder Warriors were meant to be the worst elements of humanity, the Space Marines were meant to be the best. And one day, when the galaxy was fully and truly united, the Space Marines would be able to lay down their weapons and take up new roles in this perfect society. Whether that be as politicians, council members, doctors, generals, or any other role that society would need of them. This was a job that the Thunder Warriors were not going to be capable of. Now, after Earth had been united under the Emperor's rule, one of the most important decrees that he issued was the abolishment of religious worship. The Emperor had been around a long time, and he had seen the horror.
Which is ironic because after the Horus Heresy, humanity starts worshiping him, which maybe Weshammer's going to go into more detail, but in Bricky's video, he said that the Emperor never really wanted to be worshipped as a god. So maybe Weshammer will give more information onto why or background on that.
Horrors of religion firsthand. That any decree that teaches you not to question and to accept things on faith was abhorrent to him. He had seen millions killed in the name of some religious figure time and time again, and determined that if humanity was to prosper, it would need to put its faith in science. So one by one, every religious institution on the planet was destroyed, including the very last church, the Church of the Lightning Stone, of which the Emperor oversaw the destruction of personally. With everything going according to the
That's crazy. So he just went through and obliterated all religion. If if I'm not mistaken, there is a funny South Park episode with Cartman going into the future where there's no religion, but there's still different factions of scientists are still fighting each other on which science is the true science. So I think it necessarily revolves around religion. It's just who thinks they're right.
Emperor's plans, his Space Marine legions developing and the warp storms dissipated, the Emperor would journey to Mars and form an alliance with them. Now, both planets realized that there was more to be gained through cooperation than through open warfare. So the Treaty of Mars was signed, and both planets were reunited once again. Now, I will point out that the Martian worship of machines definitely went against the Emperor's decree about religion, but he made a one-time exception for them. The rest of the solar system.
He didn't really have an option. The the people of Mars could build their machines. He needed the machines to conquer or reunite humanity. He didn't really have an option. He had to make an exception for it. That's the way I understand it.
System would be united in a similar way, and the Emperor would begin formulating his plans to reunite all of humanity. Now, in order to accomplish this, the navigators of the Imperium determined that they would need some form of anchor point in order to further explore beyond the bounds of the solar system, and thus the Astronomicon was constructed. And it functioned kind of like the North Star, in that the device produced an enormous beam of golden light that could be perceived through the psychic sight of navigators from anywhere in the galaxy.
Wow, that picture is freaking crazy. That's a little creepy right there. Where is that from? Is that from a book or art? I'd like to know the backstory on that. But regardless, I didn't know the Astronomicon was built this early. Bricky didn't go into a whole lot of information on it. He just said that after they had to have someone sitting the golden throne, and eventually when the emperor was wounded, they put him on the golden throne. Yeah, any other information you can give on that would be helpful. And maybe Wes will go into that, so we'll give him a chance.
Or even inside the warp. By using this light, they would always be able to pinpoint the exact location of Terra, and thus could use that knowledge to map the stars and make successful warp jumps. As jumping between the worlds within the solar system was one thing, but trying to make a jump halfway across the galaxy had an incredibly high probability of seeing the ship get lost and not being able to find its way back out of the Sea of Souls. In addition, the Emperor realized that his armies would need powerful generals because he couldn't be everywhere at once.
The Primarchs.
So thus he created 20 demigod-like individuals known as the Primarchs, based off of his own DNA as well as his perpetual companion known as Erda. However, before the Primarch project could be complete, a great tragedy struck, and each of the infant Primarchs was scattered across the galaxy. Now, in recent books, it was
Yeah, he's about to go into it, I think, but in Bricky's video, he mentions that the chaos was the reason for the Primarchs being scattered across the stars. But let's hear what he has to say. I'd like to know what the whole story is about that.
revealed that Erda played a major role in this. She learned of the Emperor's plans for her children and the life of endless war that awaited them. She acted against him and set her sons free, choosing to send her children as far away from their father as she could. In this way, she hoped that they could just live normal lives.
Okay, so someone in my comments in the last video mentioned something to the fact that she had something to do with the Primarchs being absconded with across the galaxy. That's fascinating.
Now, whether or not she had been manipulated by chaos is not entirely clear, but it's safe to assume that as a mother, she was doing what she thought was right for her children. Now, the Great Crusade is a period in time which the Emperor and his armies journeyed across the stars to make contact with all of the human worlds. The goal was to bring them back into the Imperium, while simultaneously locating all of the missing Primarchs. These worlds had been cut off from the rest of humanity for thousands of years, and many of them had completely forgotten their origins. Some welcomed this.
Yeah, I was mentioning that, like, you have a large empire of humanity that suddenly gets most of the planets are cut off from each other. These planets are they spend thousands of years apart from that connection to that empire. Over thousands of years, information can be lost, traditions can be lost, and then these planets start evolving on their own and evolving their own institutions, their own cultures, their own way of life, and being completely ignorant to what's going on outside of their, say, solar system that they live in. And that's why there's so much diversity of cultures, albeit a lot of them mimic human cultures from our human history, which is fascinating. But yeah, it's very cool.
Space Marines with open arms, happy to be part of something greater than themselves. Well, others were resistant and wanted to remain free. However, the Emperor's edict basically meant refusal was not an option. The worlds could either join peacefully or by force. The threat of violence from such an advanced society was often enough to bring them into compliance, but in other cases, the Imperium would unleash untold devastation across these planets until a surrender was finally issued. As the Crusade progressed, the Imperium was ramping up production on ships and new Astartes, and their armies were growing stronger and stronger by the day. Each of the worlds that was conscripted into compliance would end up having to pay a tithe to the Imperium, sometimes between 5 and 25% of all of their natural resources or human population to be used as soldiers. Additionally, over the
That's what Arbor Ian's video that I watched on the Astra Militarum, he covered that, and that planets would normally, whatever they're best at producing, they would produce that as a tithe to the Empire. But some planets, like Cadia or such, would produce more soldiers because that's what they were good at, producing massive armies of soldiers. So, yeah, very cool.
course of the Grand Crusade, each of the Primarchs would eventually be located and would be reunited with their own legion of Space Marines. In total, the Emperor created 20 different legions, each one having been crafted from the DNA of their corresponding Primarch. And since each of the Primarchs were...
Quick question for those who are out there, and you can just leave a comment on the video. Amazon's working on their 40K show with Henry Cavill kind of taking the lead on that. Has anyone heard what time period that show's going to take place, or do you have a preferred time period? Would you like to see them cover the Horus heresy? Would you like to see them cover the current timeline that's going on right now? I think Horus heresy would be fascinating to see played out in live action, but I don't. We'll see if they have the if they can even have the ability to make a good show.
Were incredibly different from one another, all of the legions had different specialties. The Raven Guard were masters of stealth-based warfare, whereas the Iron Warriors were siege experts. Now, the Great Crusade was incredibly brutal, but from the Imperium's perspective, everything was going according to plan. That was until treachery began to dig its roots throughout the Space Marine legions. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, Primarch of the Luna Wolves, who had been chosen to lead in the Emperor's absence after he returned to Terra, would turn against the Imperium and fold 9 of the 18 Space Marine legions, as well as many sects of the Imperial Guard and Adeptus Mechanicus, in a terrifying civil war against the Emperor. This event would come to be known as the Horus Heresy.
So why is the Horus Heresy so important to the storyline? This is probably the most well-documented points in time in all of 40K. And it's that moment where the hope that I mentioned before gets completely crushed. Humanity was on the right path. They were putting all the pieces back together after the end of the Age of Strife. But with the introduction of treachery to the Space Marine legions, that all came crashing down. And at the current point in the 40K timeline, they're still pretty much putting the pieces back together even 10,000 years later. Now, even though the Horus Heresy and 30K in general are technically a prequel to 40K, you could arguably call it a completely separate franchise. And one of the most important things to me in it is, as somebody who got
that he's not. I have to agree with him because the 30K / Horus Heresy time period, it is such a different time period in different circumstances from what we see in 40K. Yeah, I would love to see live action videos done of both the 30K and 40K time period, but I don't know if Amazon's that capable.
really into 40K before I knew anything about the Horus Heresy. The Primarchs were always these larger-than-life demigod-type characters, like Hercules and Odysseus, that were just spoken about as if they were legend. You didn't even really know if they were real. But when you start reading the Horus Heresy books, they're main characters. And just seeing 2 of the Primarchs interact with one another and speak to each other was mind-blowing for me. This timeline sees a lot of the factions that you'll see in 40K get incredibly fleshed out, with the exceptions of the one that haven't
30K Horus Heresy time period, it harkens back to, say, when I think of classical Greece, where they had the Greek gods and you had demigods, and that's what it feels like to me. Because you had these, like he called them, larger-than-life characters, the Primarchs. They're like demigods or even gods. Not little g, but it makes it. That's what I think of. It's like an age of mysticism and larger than life characters.
Haven't really been introduced yet, like the Tau or the Tyranids. And technically the Necrons were there too, but they were still asleep in their tomb worlds.
So the Horus Heresy is probably the most well-documented period of time within the Warhammer 40K timeline, as the entire thing is only about 9 years long, yet the Horus Heresy novel series is still being written as of the time of this recording, and has over 60 novels
so they're
in
still
it. Even more so if you count all of the novellas and short stories that were created to support them.
Fleshing out the story of the Horus Heresy.
There's an absolutely ton of stuff that happens in the series.
Cool.
But I'm going to tell you just what you need to know. So for a time, the Emperor led the Great Crusade himself. However, he needed to begin work on what was known to him as the Webway project back on Earth. This bit of information had not been revealed to any of his Primarchs, a fact that would end up causing resentment to build up in many of his sons. Now, if the project had been successful, it would have completely eliminated humanity's reliance on warp travel. Unfortunately, that didn't end up happening, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So a new War Master was
I've heard this story. The Emperor was trying to build his own Webway project. Bricky mentioned it. To reduce the risks of having to deal with the warp and chaos. Just like the Eldar did with their Webway, but it, like he said, didn't work out, and he's probably going to explain why.
Appointed to act in his stead. Horus Lupercal of the Luna Wolves was chosen for this role. Now, he was still a Primarch with his own legion, but for all intents and purposes, he would be the voice of the Emperor. Any decision that Horus made would be as if it came from the Emperor himself. Now, he had his faults, of course, just like the rest of his brothers. But when he was chosen as the War Master, even though a few Primarchs grumbled about how it should have been them, they all recognized Horus's greatness. And for a time, he served his role incredibly well. Now that would all change on the moon of Davin, when Horus was mortally injured by the planetary governor who had been corrupted by Nurgle, wielding a blade known as the
Nurgle, Papa
a sword
Nurgle.
that was said to be so deadly that it could kill even that which was unkillable. This wound placed Horus in a coma, and none of the apothecaries available on Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, were able to cure him. Now, to Horus's Marines at the time, this seemed like a freak accident. However, that's not exactly what happened. You see, there was this chaplain named Erebus, who was a member of the Wordbearers Legion and had been accompanied.
Okay. In Bricky's video, he said he didn't go into this much detail, but he did mention Erebus, and he said, "Fuck Erebus." I guess I'm gonna find out why.
Accompanying the Luna Wolves. You see, he had actually stolen the blade from a group of people known as the Interrex, and then provided it to the man that would end up landing the blow, all as part of his careful plan to end up corrupting Horus. It was revealed that he had been behind the scenes orchestrating the heresy at the command of his Primarch Lorgar, who, after having been reprimanded by the Emperor for spreading his worship, which completely went against his ideals, had sought out other gods more worthy of their devotion. The Wordbearers would inevitably discover the Chaos Gods, and set in motion events that would lead to the bloodiest civil war humanity had ever seen. Now back on the Vengeful Spirit, Erebus recommended bringing Horus to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge, a place on Davin, where they could use—
So, if I'm gathering that right, was Lorgar corrupted first? And Horus was eventually corrupted later due to this. We'll see how he is actually corrupted, but that's what it sounds like he just said.
use sorcery to heal him. Now this was a diabolic place that was linked to the ruinous powers of the Chaos Gods, a fact that was unknown to the Luna Wolves at the time. Many of the Marines were against this, but they didn't really see any other options. So in desperation, they agreed to try what Erebus wanted. And it was here in the temple that Horus was put into a dreamlike fugue state. And in this dream, he would be manipulated by the Chaos Gods and the astral spirit of Erebus into turning against the Emperor. He was shown visions of the future, of the galaxy in flames, of a human imperium that worshipped the Emperor as a god. Humanity had descended into a new dark age, and the Emperor didn't care about humanity. He had just been using them this entire time in order—
It's ironic because if Horus was rebelling because he saw this future, that's the future they get anyways, except for the way it panned out, the Emperor's injured and sitting on the throne, rotting corpse, but still it's the same end result.
to obtain godhood. Now during this, the astral spirit of Magnus, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns Legion, appeared before Horus and tried to prevent what was happening. But unfortunately, he was ultimately unsuccessful, and the corruption had taken root in Horus's heart. When Horus finally awoke, he had been healed and his allegiance had changed. He set about orchestrating the downfall of the Imperium. Now 7 of the other Primarchs, Lorgar of the Wordbearers, Mortarion of the Death Guard, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, Portorabo of the Iron Warriors, Angron of the World Eaters, Alfarius of the Alpha Legion, and Conrad Kurz—
Yeah, as far as these legions that he just mentioned, my favorite are, I think, the Death Guard and the World Eaters, because World Eaters serve Khorne and the Death Guard serve the Nurgle. I find that aesthetic, the fact that they take on that aesthetic of whatever Chaos God they're serving, to be pretty cool.
of the Night Lords would join with Horus and pledge their allegiance to his cause. Now each of the traitor Primarchs realized that not all of their Space Marines would end up following them after their heresy had been revealed, and thus it was determined which of the Marines were likely to remain loyal and which ones would side with their Primarch. With the Loyalists identified, the traitor legions would end up purging an enormous amount of their own men. This would take place on the world of Istvan III, when the Marines that were selected for purging were sent down to the planet's surface to fight against the Xeno species that had claimed it. The mission was basically bogus, and the real reason they had been sent down was the traitors in orbit planned on wiping them out all in one fell swoop.
Oh, that's wicked. So they wanted to purge their own ranks, and any of the ones that they think would have wanted to stay loyal, they sent down on a mission and just obliterated them from orbit. That's sick.
They would then inevitably virus bomb the planet, and any Marines that were not killed by the virus bombing were then set ablaze as the gas clouds were ignited and a massive wall of fire spread out
Wow.
in every direction, incinerating everything on the planet's surface. Now, there would be a couple of survivors here, such as Gavriel Loken, a Luna Wolf and one of the 4 members of the Mournival, but his story deserves its own video. With the Loyalists purged from their own legions, the traitors would move on to Istvan V, and the events there would later be known as the Drop Site Massacre. The traitors would end up calling for aid from many of the other Loyalist legions, specifically the legions that they felt they wouldn't be able to turn, no matter how convincing their argument. These included the legions and primarchs of the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard. The combined forces of the traitor legions would open fire on their own brothers here and slaughter them to a man. The Primarch
Wow.
Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands was killed by Fulgrim during this battle, but the Primarchs of the other 2 legions, Vulcan of the Salamanders and Korax of the Raven Guards, would ultimately live on. However, their legions were reduced to a mere fraction of what they once were. The Raven Guard, for example, were said to originally have 80,000 Space Marines, but after the Drop Site Massacre, that had been reduced to 5,000. Shortly after these events, and halfway across the galaxy,
Dude, that's crazy.
Magnus of the Thousand Suns would seek to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal. He did this by astral projecting all the way to Terra. He felt like sending a message the old-fashioned way wouldn't get there in time, or worse, could have been intercepted by the traitors. And shortly before this, all psychic powers had been banned at the Council of Nicaea, so in attempting to warn the Emperor, he was directly going against his orders. But Magnus was doing what he felt he had to. Unfortunately, he
All right, the reason I'm quiet right now is all this is new to me. I haven't been exposed to any of this lore. That is fascinating. Seeing how after the traitor legions organized and purged their own ranks, how they went about trying to take down the legions that they expected would be the most difficult to turn from being loyal to the Emperor. Right? It's pretty crazy stuff.
would end up being manipulated by the Chaos God of Treacheries.
And if you got anything to add on any of this stuff he's saying, that would be educate me more on this, a little more background. Just throw it in the comments, please.
Tzeentch, and ended up destroying a psychic barrier around the Sol system that the Emperor had placed to keep the forces of chaos at bay. Magnus's astral form burst into the throne room, unaware of what he was doing, and hordes of demons followed him in. The Webway project was destroyed, and the Emperor ordered the Space Wolves and Leman Russ to bring Magnus in and answer.
So Magnus is the reason for the Webway project not being able to follow through. That's that was never mentioned in Bricky's video. He just says, I think he alluded to Magnus being the reason for it not working, but that the information Wes just gave us is very gives me a lot of background into it.
Answer for his crimes. However, the message was intercepted by Horus, who changed the order to kill Magnus and the Thousand Suns, and burn their world of Prospero. The Space Wolves followed their orders and decimated the planet. In a desperate attempt to save his legion, Magnus made a pact with Tzeentch, who warped him and his surviving sons off of Prospero and to the planet of the Sorcerers, a world deep within the Eye of Terror. Later, Magnus would pledge loyalty to Horus, not out of some form of malice like his brothers.
It is something I learned in one of the previous videos I watched, that is a lot of the Traitor Legion's homeworlds, due to the heresy and the being traitors, a lot of their homeworlds were destroyed, utterly destroyed.
But because he had directly been betrayed by the Imperium. The War Master would lead a horrifically violent crusade against the Imperium, working ever closer towards Terra and the Imperial Palace. Eventually, the traitors would siege Terra. Horus had been infused with the power of all of the Chaos Gods, and in a great climactic final battle, would engage the Emperor in combat. Still seeing the good in his son, the Emperor would end up holding back.
Horus was infused with all 4 powers of the Chaos Gods. That's insane. I say that because you have certain traitor legions that gravitated towards a certain Chaos God. You have certain legions that kind of serve chaos as a whole, but seeing Horus, being infused with all their powers, or the powers of all 4 before he fights the Emperor, would probably explain why he killed the Emperor. Didn't kill the Emperor. Wounded him to the point where they had to put him on the throne.
Unleashing his full power, hoping desperately that Horus could still be saved and redeemed. In this moment of weakness, Horus managed to land a mortal wound on the Emperor, and with that, the Emperor realized that there was no saving his son. that he had been completely lost to him. So the Emperor unleashed his full
this
power
artwork is-
and
I've said
obliterated
this multiple
Horus
times
so
before.
completely that not even his soul
The artwork for this series, the 40K, is just amazing. I don't know who they got to give more credit to the people that did these pieces of art. It's awesome.
survived. Now, in order to keep the Emperor alive, the Astronomicon was quickly converted into a makeshift life support system. The Emperor's psychic might would be used to power it, and the machine would keep him from truly dying. And here the Emperor would remain for the next 10,000 years, his physical body little more than a decaying corpse. Well, his spiritual body was free to roam the warp, and by all accounts, has been growing stronger ever since. Now, one of the greatest ironies of 40K is that since the Emperor is a perpetual, if he was to physically die, he would be reborn. This is a fact that the other members of the Imperium are not aware of. So over the last 10,000 years, they've been doing everything they can to keep him alive. But if he had just been allowed to die, he would have.
I gotta ask. So anyone who dives into the books for 40K, do you think? Because I've read, or I think it was in one of the videos, people were explaining to me the Cadia and the rebirth of Guilliman or Girly Man, whatever you want to call him, that do you think this may be moving towards a future story where the Emperor returns? Let's say he dies and returns, and a new phase in 40K begins. That would be cool. I think it would be an interesting move forward, or do you think that would be a bad idea? Let me know.
Would have come back. The traitor legions would be pushed back from Terra. With the War Master dead, their siege had failed. And in the period of time leading up to the 31st millennium, an event known as the Scouring would take place, where all of the traitor legions were hunted down and forced into exile within the Eye of Terror. After the heresy had fully concluded, the Imperium was left to put all of the pieces back together. The Emperor was gone, the traitor legions had been pushed back, and a period of rebuilding took place. In order to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again, a council of representatives known as the High Lords of Terra were implemented to rule in the Emperor's place, each coming from a different background and having different goals and objectives rather than the Imperium being.
I've seen this piece of artwork, and I've seen it explained. I think it was in the Astra Militarum video about this council. That is some crazy artwork right there. Really creepy looking as well.
Being ruled by a single individual. Now, that being said, they were also supposed to quote-unquote interpret the Emperor's will. Additionally, Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, would propose that the Space Marine legions be broken up into chapters, each of which containing no more than 1,000 members. The idea was that if treachery on this scale had happened once before, then it could inevitably happen again, and no single man should have the power of an entire Space Marine legion at his disposal. Many of the Primarchs did not agree with this.
That makes sense. I saw that in one of the previous videos, how they explained it. And that's exactly what he said. Any one man has too much power, it can go to his head, and then he may be corrupted by that power.
Namely Vulcan of the Salamanders, whose legion had been reduced to just a mere fraction of its original power, or Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fist, who viewed this action as a further weakening of the legion's strength after they had just concluded the bloodiest civil war in their history. Regardless of how they felt,
I love his
the
armor.
book that Guilliman had penned that outlined how all of the chapters should be organized, known as the Codex Astartes, was eventually implemented, and all of the legions were broken up.
The 10,000 years between the Horus Heresy and the 41st millennium is where the bulk of 40K lore takes place. This is where the majority of the books are set. And you could make the argument that all of these events are definitely important, but they're not critical to understanding the framework of the entirety that is 40K. But there are a few details that I feel like you need to understand. The first and most major is that during this time period, we see all of the Primarchs inevitably end up disappearing. And all for various reasons. Leman Russ dives into the warp, headed off after the traitors. Corvus Corax disappears in shame after he tried to rebuild his legion by cutting corners. And inevitably accidentally made a whole bunch of Raven Guard abominations. And Guilliman was mortally wounded by his brother Fulgrim, and subsequently put in stasis. So it's kind of mirroring what happened with his father. In the span of this 10,000 years, we'll also see the Damocles Crusade, where the Tower introduced to the storyline. First contact with the Tyranids also occurs here. Oh yeah, and the alarm clock for the Necrons ends up going off, and all their tomb worlds start coming back online. But we're jumping ahead to the 13th Black Crusade, because this is where the timeline finally started moving forward.
Oh.
When we find ourselves in the 41st millennium, the events of the Horus Heresy have slipped into
Wasn't well, he's gonna say in a second. I don't know. I don't know how old this video is, so I'm not sure how if he's gonna get into it. But get into the most recent stuff with Cadia, destruction of Cadia, uh, Guilliman coming back. But we'll see. I'm not sure if the 13th Crusade has something to do with that.
Legend. Most people alive during this time have no idea what transpired back then, whether that be because of the intentional purging of specific documents, a covering up of the truth, or just that it happened so long ago that they don't remember. This isn't true of the Space Marines. They remember it all too well. But whereas most of the Loyalist Marines that are alive in the 41st millennium know of these events because of the records kept by their chapter, however, when it comes to the traitor Marines that exist in the Eye of Terror, time flows differently there. And most of those Marines were the very same individuals that participated in the Horus Heresy. So they remember those events because they were actually there. Now, the Eye of Terror was a pretty terrible place to live. There really weren't a lot of resources, and the traitor legions were far from united, each one of them fracturing off into a bunch of different warbands, led by various powerful warlords that were pretty much just pursuing their own interests. In fact, at this point, Chaos fought amongst itself more than it ever fought against the Imperium or Xenos. Now, one of these Space Marines in particular was named...
Is that one thing that keeps Chaos ultimately from completely dominating everyone? Is that they just like with the orcs, they fight each other just as often as they fight everyone else? Let me know. But yeah, this is fascinating talking, and I've mentioned this before. The traitor legions aligning with certain chaos gods, and just as the name says, chaos. They're not really united on any one front. But yeah.
Abaddon, and he had been the first captain of the Luna Wolves and one of the 4 members of Horus's Mournival during the Horus Heresy. Abaddon sought to unite the traitors and would end up reforming his legion, drawing members from all of the various Chaos warbands. This legion would be called the Black Legion. Over the several thousand years that passed between the Horus Heresy and the 41st millennium, Abaddon, or an appointed representative, would lead what were known as the Black Crusades, Chaos incursions out of the Eye of Terror back into real space, to attack various Imperial worlds. Now, for the longest time, it looked like the traitors just weren't really very good at conquering, as every single crusade ultimately failed to bring about the complete collapse of the Imperium. However, it was revealed in the last few years that each one of these crusades had a much smaller objective, that Chaos was actually playing the long game. The very first of these Black Crusades...
So, he just answered my question from earlier. So when Chaos can unite, and the Chaos Marines specifically, when they can unite for a common goal, they can be more successful at an ultimate goal and playing the long game, like he said.
Would take place in the 31st millennium, about 500 years after the Scouring. Now, in response to these raids, the Imperium would end up fortifying the planet that was right outside of the Eye of Terror, known as Cadia, and it became one of the most fortified positions in the entire Imperium next to Terra itself. For 10,000 years, Cadia stood sentinel right outside of the Eye, ready to punish and push back anything that would try to leave it. However, in the 41st millennium,
I going into the Astra Militarum, which is one of my favorite armies. I really like the Cadians. They're one of my favorites so far.
All of the small victories that Chaos had managed to achieve over the previous 12 Crusades would come together in the 13th. This was the period that saw Abaddon's forces assault the Cadian Gate, and in the end, Abaddon ended up sacrificing one of his Blackstone fortresses, an ancient alien spaceship.
Okay, I think he is going to go into it. He's going to talk about the destruction of Cadia and maybe the return of Guilliman. I don't know. That's I'm not sure how new that is to the lore, but he may cover that.
Made of the same material the Necrons used back during the War in Heaven to create their pylons. He hurled it at Cadia like an artificial meteor, the impact being absolutely apocalyptic, and not just for the planet, but for the vast network of Blackstone pylons that had been built under Cadia's surface millions of years ago by the Necrons. You see, Cadia wasn't existing just as a blockade for anything trying to come out of the Eye of Terror, but that system of Blackstone had actually been keeping it from growing. With Cadia destroyed, the Eye began to grow out of control, and would eventually spread all the way across the galaxy. This was known as the Cicatrex Maledictum.
That's right. It's what divided the Imperium in two. Yeah, so I remember this from a previous video, I believe. But it's basically a warp scar that cuts the entire galaxy in half.
commonly as the Great Rift. It split the universe completely in half, and all of the Imperial worlds that were on the opposite side of Terra were suddenly plunged into darkness, and were cut off from the rest of the Imperium. To say this was a massive victory for the forces of chaos is a gross understatement. This was single-handedly one of the most devastating events in the entire history of the galaxy. And after the forming of the Great Rift is the time period we currently find ourselves in the 40k timeline. Recent events have seen the resurrection of Gilliman, who's come back to lead the Imperium, and is pretty horrified by what he's seeing, as it's been completely dominated by superstition and religion, where they worship his father as a god even though thousands of years ago he specifically told them not.
I remember that from one of the previous videos. He awakes to see the Empire being, or Imperium being exactly what, like he just said, what his father did not want it to be. And he's disgusted and depressed by it, and decides to take action.
Not to. During this time, we would also see the rise of the Primaris Marines, and the induction of Gilliman's Indomitus Crusade, which sought to reunite the worlds on the other side of the Great Rift.
I saw the Primaris Marines in Space Marine 2, because your character Titus at one point becomes a Primaris Marine. I know that they have extra organs, they're stronger than the original model from Space Marines, but that's about all I know about it.
But these are all topics that we'll dive in more in future videos.
And that's it. That's everything that I feel like you need to understand about 40k in order to understand the storyline. And the things that I chose to leave out, it's not that they're not important. It's just that things like the Age of Strife and the 13th Black Crusade end up being a lot more important than something like the Damocles Crusade. You could read 100 of the 40k novels and never touch anything in the War of the Beast or the War for Armageddon, and you probably wouldn't be too confused. But if you don't know what an STC is, or know what the Age of Strife was, you're probably gonna get pretty confused because these things tend to come up a lot. But what do you guys think? Do you feel strongly that an event that I left out should have been mentioned in this video? If so, let me know down in the comments what it is and why you feel so strongly about it. And a lot of YouTubers at the end of their video tell you to like and subscribe, which if you wanna do that, it's super appreciated.
He's just about finished here. I'm gonna go ahead and close out the video. Speaking of like and subscribe, go check out his video. Give it a like and subscribe. Go check out his channel. I'm going to have his channel linked in the description for this video. Go check him out. I will probably be doing more videos on his lore videos in the future. Also, if you like what I do, give me a like, follow, subscribe. If you also like video game content, you can come check out my YouTube streams. I stream video games 3 to 5 times a week, so just come check that out. I'm going to be playing Dark Tides every Friday, Vermintide on Saturdays, and I may slip in some Space Marine 2 in there every now and then. But yeah, if you like what I do, give me a like, follow, subscribe, and until next time, see ya!